Okay, it's 3:30 in Rome, so I'll start this session while other participants may be joining us. So good afternoon from Rome, and good evening and good morning to all participants. I'm happy to welcome you to this session on the evolution of country-led evaluations and the contribution to the SDGs. This session is jointly supported and organized by EvalForward, which is the community of practice that I facilitate, and by EvalPartners. EvalPartners and Nicola is also behind the organization of this session. The aim of today, of this hour we will spend together, is to really look at the evolution of country-led evaluations from different points of view. We will start by looking at a recent UNEG report, which is the report by the United Nations Evaluation Group on National Evaluation Capacity Development, and what does country-led evaluation mean from the perspective of the UN agencies and a country's perspective. So we will look at it from different points of view and angles. Let's have a look quickly at the agenda. We will have Ian Goldman setting the scene of the session today, and then we have three short presentations from a country, so the perspective of Tim Lubanga of the Office of Prime Minister of Uganda on the evolution of country-led evaluations towards the SDGs. Then we will have a reflection from the perspective of the World Food Programme with Grace Igueta, a reflection on how joint evaluations can be carried out jointly with governments. So she will lead us through the experience with Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia, and Benin. Then we have a presentation by Olivier Cosset of the FAO Office of Evaluation on the challenges and opportunities of country-led evaluations, using the example of a recent evaluation of FAO contribution to the SDG 2. So how he approached this evaluation and how can this lead to learnings also for country-led evaluations. We will have also time for discussion, and this will be facilitated by Ian Goldman, and also questions and answers from the public, of course, and from the audience. So I invite you since now to use the chat to ask your questions. And I also like to remind you that this session is being recorded and that we will share the recordings and the presentations with all of you, with all the participants. So without taking more of this time, I will just introduce Ian Goldman that will facilitate the session and set the scenes for this discussion. Ian established South Africa's national evaluation system, and he works with many organizations, including CLEAR centers, the Global Evaluation Initiatives, and is also a professor at the University of Cape Town. So over to you, Ian. Thanks to all.
Hello, everybody. And I worked with the UNEG working group, which Renata and Heather Bryant chaired on this report. So just giving you a flavour of what's come out from it. And it was focusing on national evaluation capacity development, the evolution of national evaluation systems, and particularly looking at the implementation of the Resolution 69237. Next slide. And this resolution was about building capacity for the evaluation at country level. And it reiterates the importance of building national capacity for evaluation. It reaffirms that national capacity for the evaluation of development activities may be strengthened by the UN agencies, but based on the principle of national ownership. Notes that evaluation at country level should be voluntary and carried out upon request by member states, and invites UN entities with national stakeholders to strengthen the capacity of member states for evaluation. So this work looked at what has happened about this resolution of 2014. Next slide. And UNEG has come to a definition of NECD, which is that NECD is the process whereby state and non-state entities and individuals expand, reinforce, and sustain national capacity to manage, produce, and use evaluation. And it supports the strengthening of a country-owned national system within its particular context, both whether through direct or indirect effects. Next slide. Now, there is a theory of change, and I'm not going to go through it, but if you go into the report, you'll see a theory of change, and this report looked at that theory of change and how it was working in practice. Next slide. We surveyed all UN agencies, but particularly the ones who responded were the 14 who have an NECD role. We did 6 country case studies, 76 interviews, and we looked at the main evaluation repositories to see how many evaluations that were done in each country could be accessed publicly. And there's been extensive work by the UNEG working group on taking this forward and working and smoothing the recommendations and making them as most relevant as possible. And I just want to quickly go through those recommendations, because in a sense, that's the agenda for today's meeting. So first of all, the first recommendation was that all UN agencies should conduct their evaluations in a way that builds national capacity development. So the way you do it, that countries should play a meaningful role in evaluation governance. Sometimes this is only token, and they're really not playing a significant role in steering committees, for example. We need to look at joint evaluations and country-led evaluations, again, not token, that should use national evaluation systems if they exist in the process strengthening the systems, and where possible, we should use and strengthen local evaluators. Recommendation 2. Next slide, Nicola. Was in line with the resolution, the UN agencies should continue to support the capacity development of national evaluation ecosystems, including support to the enabling environment, institutional and individual capacity. So the first one was there about supporting analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the system and helping to develop a capacity development plan. And some of you may be aware of the MESA process, which the Global Evaluation Initiative has been supporting, which can be one way of doing this. Secondly, supporting the engagement of senior policymakers and using, and actually this recommendation has 2 parts to it. First of all, is about getting the senior policymakers engaged, which is important in its own right. But secondly, the idea that you can use these joint and country-led evaluations as pilots of the system. And for example, in South Africa, we piloted our system with an evaluation which UNICEF supported. And then thirdly, to involve non-state actors, and then to look at the integration of the cross-cutting issues, including climate, gender, and integration of the SDGs. And then the last recommendation, that UN agencies should coordinate and collaborate on NECD at different levels. And because often the UN agencies are working in isolation themselves, and that's not helpful to countries. So they should include NECD as part of the mandates. They should ensure there's at least information sharing and possibly collaboration and joint work at all levels. And the NECD should be an explicit part of country programs. So they're not just doing evaluations for internal purposes, but they're seeing NECD as something that should actually be fostered. Next slide. So we got 3 speakers today. We got Tim Lubanga, who's been a pioneer in taking forward evaluation in Africa from the Office of the Prime Minister. We've got Grace Igueta, who leads on capacity development in WFP's office evaluation, and Olivier Cosset, who leads the Africa group in the FAO office of evaluation. And so with that, I'm going to invite Tim to start and give us his wisdom.
Thanks, Ian, and greetings to all who are participating in this discussion this afternoon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So the story in Uganda is an evolving one. And so in terms of what developments have taken place in the national M&E system since the SDGs were approved. So we were lucky in Uganda that the SDGs were approved just 1 year after Cabinet adopted our national M&E policy. So it found when we were really getting started with implementing a policy that took us quite a bit of time to prepare. So the first activity was to prepare an operational plan for the policy. That was 2014, 2015. And then we then established a new performance assessment framework, a very robust performance assessment framework, which was transitioned from what we used to call a joint assistance framework, which was done with the donors and development partners, to a government-led government performance assessment framework, which culminates into a cabinet retreat that discusses annual performance of all government departments. Then we also developed, as a result of the policy, a government evaluation agenda. This government evaluation agenda is the framework that drives the policy, program, and project evaluations that we do at the national level. And then we had also to initiate a process of harmonizing the national development plan with the SDGs, because we had now a national planning framework, and then we had a global planning framework. And we quickly did a mapping. Initial level of alignment was low, but the statistic I quote there, 72.8%, is a level of alignment that we have attained over a period of time. And the other key milestone was developing of a new M&E strategy, which adopts the program-based approach, because the National Development Planning Framework itself changed, adopted a program-based approach. So then we had to develop a new strategy for that. And now we are currently developing a new evaluation agenda, actually. So that is kind of a summary of the key milestones that took place over the period. In terms of the partnerships with the UN agencies, we have quite a good network of partners here, and we do work quite a lot with the country UN agencies. For example, we have just in the process of concluding an impact evaluation with the WFP on one of our refugee programs. And this is an impact evaluation of, we are looking at cash transfers with a combination of nutritional benefits for children, lactating mothers, and we're seeing the impact of that on stuntedness. A very, very interesting study, which we think could be scaled up for the refugee and the disadvantaged groups here. But in a longer term relationship, we have a long-term relationship with UNICEF. They supported the development of the M&E policy itself. And now we are working with UNICEF on a number of things. We are doing a capacity needs assessment across all government departments in order to develop a capacity building program, actually. And we are involving institutions like CLEAR and a number of other local NGOs here to be part of that process. We are also working with UNICEF on the new M&E strategy to revise the program-based approach. And we are also, as I said, developing a new evaluation agenda, which Cabinet wants to adopt for the next 4 or 5 years. And again, UNICEF is partnering, supporting that process. We also have a long-term relationship with UNDP, which funded the first operational plan for the M&E policy. But we also have been working with UNDP on a number of capacity building initiatives for NDP3. We are hiring a number of long-term technical assistants and other activities. UNDP also finances the SDGs Secretariat, hosted here in the Office of the Prime Minister, and very much linked to the M&E work that we do here. And we are pursuing other areas of relationship with UN Women, especially around gender statistics and mainstreaming gender in our M&E work. And finally, next slide. Just in terms of the proposed resolution, we, as Uganda, we would be very supportive of a new resolution on country-led evaluations for SDGs. And we see a number of opportunities. For example, these international commitments provide the basis and the background and justification for our own national reforms, we have very strong arguments that we make on the basis of the international commitments. But secondly, they strengthen our systems in terms of quality. Our own M&E system has been evaluated and rated quite highly because we have tried to develop and improve aspects of it, indicator frameworks, capacity to do reporting, and so on. Basically, because we have done a lot of comparison to other better systems that exist elsewhere in the world. So they help us address issues of quality, capacity, and so on. And finally, we believe that this would enhance collaboration, partnership, sharing through events like this, but also other mechanisms of collaboration. So Ian, that's what I wanted to share in terms of the journey we have taken and some of our views on this. Thank you very much.
And just to say, I think that Tim's been part of a project called Twendembele, which has been building capacity around evaluation in different African countries. There's 6 countries that are part of that at the moment. So with that, we hand over to Grace and to have a UN agency perspective.
You're muted, Grace.
We can see you.
Okay, you can see me and you can hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, lovely. So good afternoon, colleagues. Yes, my name is Grace. I work with the World Food Program based in Rome. 7 months ago, I was based in South Africa for 4 years. So the experience I'm going to share was partly my own personal experience working with the national institutions in the Southern Africa, as well as one example in West Africa, my colleagues in West Africa. So for anyone that is not aware of the World Food Program, we are present in 120 plus countries, working on food security and nutrition. And evaluation is very much part of the work we do because we believe in evidence, being able to inform internally our own work and externally the partners that we work with, especially the government, the national institutions. So with that, I wanted to reflect on why I think that jointly doing evaluative work with national institutions, it's actually a way of building capacities, because there are very many ways of building capacities, supporting government, from trainings, providing equipment or other things. So I am convinced that doing evaluative work together with national institutions, it's a very viable instrument for developing capacities. And this is one of the quotes that drives me towards that thinking. So Franklin said, if you tell me something, I will forget. If you teach me, I will remember. If you involve me, I will learn. So in the context of evaluation, when we talk about building capacities and people learning, we basically want people to learn and have capacities for 3 things: that they can demand evidence, and listening to Tim, we can see how that will work in a national context, that then they can generate evidence, that they have capacity to generate evidence, and finally, they have capacity to use that evidence. So that's what drives us to focus on how can we design joint evaluations with national institutions so that we can contribute to that capacity to do those 3 things in specific countries. So as mentioned, we have had experience in several countries across the world, India, a few countries, Latin America, but here I'm focusing on African case studies. We've had one evaluation completed in Eswatini with the Ministry of Education. We have one going on right now with Ministry of Agriculture and Education. We have similarly one evaluation completed in Lesotho with the Ministry of Education, and one going on now with the Ministry of Forestry on Public Works. We completed one joint evaluation in Namibia with the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture. And finally in Benin we had one midterm evaluation of a national school feeding program there, and currently there is a final evaluation going on, conducting those jointly with the national institutions, the ministries. So the experience
I just want to stop you, Grace, because there's no presentation being shared. Are you going to share, or Nicola sharing?
So you can't see my screen?
No.
Oh, sorry. I thought I was sharing.
No.
Now?
Yes, now we can see it.
Oh, okay. Sorry. All right. So I shared I talked about the World Food Program and where we are, and the title of my presentation, Joint Evaluations as Instruments of Capacity Development, some reflections from World Food Program. And then I shared the quote, and here are the countries that we're going to share. Benin, Namibia, Lesotho, and Eswatini, and all of them with the national ministries in those countries, mostly school meals, and there's a reason why. In Africa, school meals are very popular because governments consider them as part of their social protection, and of course they are popular with the populations, and so it's an area that WFP supports. So I was just getting to hear how we think the key principles if joint evaluations are to contribute to capacity development. The first is there has to be mutual desire to learn. And I think here you mentioned that it can be token. It can be, okay, we're working with governments. There has to be that mutual commitment. We want to learn and we want also to account jointly. There has to be high level commitment from both sides, the agency and the government, the particular ministry. There has to be co-design and co-management and co-governance. So it has to be joint and jointly owned. So there has to be a joint development of action plans once you have recommendations so that you can then take action together, and knowledge transfer to the extent possible. So here we're assuming the UN system has there's a lot of knowledge on the UN side, whether it's tools, whether it's other things that we can share. So there has to be that practical knowledge transfer within the course of the process. And finally, something I think here you mentioned as well, there has to be intentional use of national or regional evaluators in the process itself, in terms of the team that does the evaluation. So speaking on high level, so the example of Namibia, so it's a government that is committed to making sure that this particular program actually runs and achieves its objectives. They have an M&D framework, national framework, and the ministry was committed to conduct an evaluation. So there was high level commitment. On the WFP side, our 5-year country strategic plan was very clear. We will conduct an evaluation. So that gave us the space to actually conduct the evaluation jointly. So high level commitment. The second principle I mentioned, which is a mutual learning, co-production of knowledge. So the first thing, and here you mentioned, use national frameworks where they exist. Because we could easily have used the WFP log frame and M&D framework, but we looked at the countries, in all these countries that we do this evaluation, say, what's your framework for that program? And we have our own framework for the piece that we were supporting you, and then we combine those together. So the example here that I give of Eswatini, so there are a number of program frameworks that cut across the Ministry of Education, the Prime Minister's office, because children are part of the education, but also social welfare. And we looked at those and we said, we have to make sure the evaluation actually uses the frameworks that are national and covers the part of the WFP support, so that then the knowledge generated is guided by those frameworks. The second, of course, co-designing the program, the evaluation together, designing the scope, designing the timelines, and all the other elements. Importantly, co-chairing the steering committee. So our director and the director of the different ministries in different countries, they co-chair the committees and they co-sign. So if you look at the one I shared earlier, these two senior people co-signed the final evaluation report with the recommendations. So we're committed to implement these recommendations and join sharing the lessons. So we've tried to go in conferences and other places with our colleagues in these ministries to share these lessons. So if those principles are adhered to, the key question before I hand over to you, Ian, is how would that lead to capacities? First is to remember that capacities are vested in people, right? It's people that learn, it's people that do start things. So if you walk that journey with a number of government people like the ones you can see in the picture, we're sitting around the table, we're designing an evaluation, we're deciding the tools to use. By the time you're done a number of months, 6-9 months, you've learned collectively, but there's something, as a UN agency, there's something you're leaving behind with the national counterparts, whether you're sharing some tools you've used before. And you hope then that can, create some momentum. And then the second thing in terms of use of evidence, if that process leads to an action plan, it's a commitment to implement the recommendations, then again, you're creating the capacity to use evidence, which probably in some of the organizations, even the governments, it's not always commonplace that people prepare an action plan after an evaluation. So I've seen that even within the UN agencies. But if you have that part of the process, by the time there's a signed action plan, like we have one for Namibia, for example, if we go 2 years from today, you could see the use of evidence, and that's the capacity that we think joint evaluations could actually build over time. But the last point, you need a lot of patience to do this. And I'm sure we'll get to some of those discussions on other elements that you need, but those are the key principles. And I think from WFP experience and the UNEG review that Ian mentioned, there's a lot of potential to do more of this type of work, more of this type of evaluations to develop capacities at different levels. Back to you, Ian.
Thanks, Grace. And I'm going to move straight away over to Olivier from FAO.
Thank you so much, Jan. Can you see me?
Yep.
Yes, I'm going to share my screen. Give me a little second.
Grace, can you stop sharing?
Yes, let me try.
Okay, and we'll start from the beginning. Can you see it?
No, Grace is still sharing.
Yeah.
Oh.
Is it showing?
No, not yet. Grace is still sharing.
Not yet. That's strange. My screen tells me that I am sharing.
It is showing.
Yeah, now you are. Over to you, Olivia.
Wonderful. That's Scandinavian. Great. So thank you, Jan, and thank you, colleagues, for the invitation. I don't work at country level. I work in Rome in the Office of Evaluation of FAO. And my contribution to this panel is perhaps less on really how mechanically or practically a country can do some of this work, although I might try to go into that. It's more on a little bit of a sobering perhaps message or a word of caution on the complexity and difficulty of doing an evaluation of your contribution, of anybody's contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are very fashionable, the SDG evaluations, but as we've found in FAO, they come with their own set of complexity, and this complexity needs to be managed. And so when I hear that countries are going to do or are already doing the SDGs evaluations, and we had discussions with Jan on this topic, I mean, my contribution basically is to say, it's a bit hard to do. So go into it with, with your heads up and aware that there are a number of possible roadblocks in the way. But also part of my message is that it's not undoable. It's perfectly doable, but you have to be aware that it's not so easy. So let me try and be a little more specific. This was based on an evaluation we did of FAO's contribution to SDG 2 on zero hunger. And zero hunger, SDG 2, as we calculated, is about 80% or 90% of what FAO does. So this evaluation was a bit overwhelming, as you might guess. And the way we cracked that nut, I think, was interesting. We did make a lot of mistakes and we struggled a lot, and I thought that we could share a little bit of the lessons. So the first challenge for an SDG evaluation is that the SDGs are not self-contained. Each of them is connected to pretty much all of them. So, and including at the target level, right? So in scoping an evaluation of a government or a program or a ministry contribution to a particular SDG or to a set of SDGs, the question of scope becomes very, very quickly important. And if you scope it too broadly or too theoretically, you will not be able to complete, or the risk is that you will embrace too much. So my advice is to scope pragmatically. There will never be a perfectly self-contained SDG evaluation because the SDGs are not self-contained. So in scoping your evaluation, make your decisions based on what you can do pragmatically. Don't try and be perfectly logical in your scoping. You will never achieve that. It's a pragmatic decision. The second difficulty is that since they are all interconnected and the 2030 agenda really emphasized this interconnection very, very heavily, including in the language of some targets that reflect or mimic the language of other targets. So you have all this interconnection. It's very complicated. How is it possible to evaluate something so complicated? The advice here is basically not to lose yourself in the maze, to yes, affront complexity and try to understand that maze, but make sure that you get out of the maze at some point. And once you've done a decent effort to understand all these interconnections of your evaluation and the goals you're trying to evaluate, do simplify them. Do in your communication, not shy away from simplifying, because if you try to get across all these interconnections and all these complexities, again, it will be too complicated, you will fail, it will be too much to absorb. Same in your evaluation tools. Base them on your analysis of the problem indeed, but don't be afraid to simplify, to simplify, to simplify. Otherwise, it's hard to do. The 2030 agenda is also very comprehensive. I would be hard pressed to find a development issue that is not contained in that agenda. Very much different from the MDG agenda, right? So it's very comprehensive, and so one cannot typically evaluate everything. So how do you solve that nut? The way we did in FAO for the SDG 2 evaluation, as I said, we had to evaluate 90% of the work of the organization. Evidently, when we went about it was to sample, but we didn't sample randomly. We sampled purposefully on the programs and projects and initiatives that had the greatest apparent potential to contribute to the transition to more equitable and sustainable development. Why did we do so? Because one, in trying to understand the SDGs, we came to the conclusion that basically the agenda is about a transition to more equitable and sustainable development. It can be summarized this way. It's a very good way to summarize it. That's one. Two, so we have to evaluate this transition, basically. Two, we focused on programs that had the greatest potential to contribute there in order to learn. Because of course we are, those evaluations are formative. They're supposed to contribute to an improvement of the work. And so if you look at works that have done nothing towards this transition, you will not learn anything. Finally, another difficulty amongst the many of them is that there are so many actors contributing to the SDGs or trying to contribute to them. So in fact, it's very hard to arrive at a clear attribution for anything at that level to any particular organization, ministry, or body. So the way again to approach this thing from a pragmatic standpoint, which is very much my standpoint as an evaluator, to try and make it work. The way that we approach this is that we mapped the roles that FAO should play towards the SDGs. That is to say, FAO is not expected to contribute everywhere across them. FAO is expected to do a few things to contribute to them. And once you understand those few things, then it becomes much easier to say whether FAO is playing its role or not. It's not saying it's because of FAO that this or that happened. It's just saying within the team, right, within this very broad team of players, FAO has tried to play its role or not. That you can say, okay? So this is a few possible solutions to a few of the challenges that one meets in a SDG evaluation. Now let me go a bit into perhaps the weeds and show a bit this complexity. The first thing we did was try to understand, as I said, the roles played by FAO, and we listed them so as to be able to evaluate them. I don't want to go into this maze, once again, too much and lose you in there, but what I want to say here is that understanding roles is important. And once we've done this work, we realize that there are basically three ways of achieving the SDGs. Three channels, if you wish. One is at the top of your graph here, it's here, is to monitor the achievement as a way to argue and press for more commitment to them. That is to say, it's the accountability role of the indicators. FAO's role to play here calculating some of these indicators. So that's the first role, the accountability mechanism of the agenda. The second function in the middle is about development actors, if you wish, and development work becoming more coherent around large national development programs, right? So the idea here is to say, forget about all this wide pilot projects implemented by zillions of actors. Development needs to gel. We need to come together and collaborate around large, at-scale development programs. Okay, so that's the point in the middle. Are we acting at scales with a wide variety of partners? And then the point in the bottom is the role for the pilot projects. FAO does a lot of that. And the justification for doing all that is to elaborate or test strategies for SDG achievement. So there's a role for piloting, but we shouldn't stay in the pilot. The SDGs call for at-scale development. So this piloting role is a learning device, is a device to learn what works and what doesn't, and that's all what it is. So basically, FAO does these three things: piloting, supporting national development, accounting for achievements to the SDGs. And once you understood that clearly, you could easily evaluate those roles. Okay, so that's an illustration of how you can use this work to understand what to evaluate. And the second illustration here is to try and show that the SDGs are not just any other target. It's easy or tempting, perhaps, to treat them as just, a set of targets, just like there are many other sets of targets around. But once you try to really understand them, there is energy in those targets. There is meaning and there is direction in those targets. And the reason why there is so much good material and energy in them is that, if you remember, the SDGs came from countries, right, Jan? The MDGs came from the OECD, but the SDGs came from the countries themselves. There was a massive amount of consultation done, which means that all these targets are maybe a bit complicated, a bit very exhaustive, but they have also a lot of good stuff in them, a lot of energy. So once we did that for SDG 2, we were able to group them, to group the targets and to start to understand what they were really saying. And what we thought they were really saying, we translated the goal into this idea that world nations needs to reorient the agricultural support system, research, extension, etc., and their policies and also their markets, so as to favor this evolution towards more sustainable, inclusive, more equitable agriculture, right? So we try to understand what we were trying to evaluate before we started to evaluate it. Finally, I will finish with the sort of overview of the process that we followed. So we understood the issue conceptually. That's the first table here as one of assessing this qualitative evolution to a sustainable development. Once we understood that, we developed tools and questions that were embedded in that framework. So a coherent evaluation tools embedded in the framework, and we applied this framework on a large number of case studies, selected based on their potential for learning, as I said, not just randomly, but the most interesting bits of work, right? And then finally, we synthesized the results, we brought it all together by comparison and triangulation at the end of the process. And so this process could be called, I was discussing with a colleague from South Africa, actually, Dirk Trotsky from the West Cape Department of Agriculture, and he's done something very, very similar, and we were comparing our notes. And basically he said, you know, it's not that difficult. We have a saying in South Africa, we say, how to eat an elephant? You just cut it into pieces. So that's what I used for the presentation. But as Jan reminded me, it's not that simple, because at the end, you need to put the pieces back together, right? And this is the difficulty. So if you have a common framework of evaluation, embedded, simple, huh? But embedded in the SDG framework, and you apply that evaluation framework with tools across a large number of case studies, then it makes sense to put them together. It's easy to put them together because the information has been collected with the same tools, right? And so the questions are the same. So that's how we survived this particular evaluation. Now, I understand it's not a country-led evaluation, but it faced a lot of the methodological problems that probably a country trying to evaluate its SDG will face. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivier. And you know, looking forward to you putting questions in the chat. While you're thinking about those questions, I'm just going to ask Tim. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to people on the panel just to get the discussion going. Tim, you know, you listed some evaluations where you'd had support from the UN, but what do you think could be done? I mean, bearing in mind those recommendations that I put at the beginning and also what Grace presented, what do you think could be done to help make sure that the UN can support you better and in a less fragmented way, rather than individual agencies doing their own thing? It's done in a more integrated way that supports you. What's your thoughts on that? Tim, did you hear me?
I think for us, the answer to that is yes. You don't hear me?
Yes, we hear you now. Yep.
Oh, okay. So I was saying it's quite straightforward for us. It's for if all the UN support the development and implementation of the agenda, because once we develop a national framework, anything that is implemented outside that framework kind of undermines it and causes confusion. So in our case, despite this collaboration and partnership we have with the UN agencies, they still do a lot of things outside the system. They still commission lots of work with other NGOs on their own. Many times we are not even aware of. And sometimes the reports we are required to provide an explanation when these reports maybe reach cabinet or parliament and so on. So they still do a lot of things outside the system. So I think a bigger move towards working on a joint agreed framework. Here we are happy that the UN invites us to participate quite intensively when they're developing their comprehensive, it has that long terminology, but their comprehensive framework for engagement with the country. Yes, so that's a good process. We are part of their planning framework, and they are grossly involved in our planning framework. But when it comes to implementation, they do other things outside us. So it causes a bit of confusion. So here I'm reporting that yes, we have aligned all stakeholders together, but in reality, there's a lot that goes on outside there, and we really get it by surprise. So it's kind of, yeah, we trust the system, but yeah, at some extent. I think that's one move that would be very, very helpful.
Thanks. And putting it on the other foot, I mean, Grace, you know, I really liked your slides with the, you know, joint evaluations and mutual learning and co-production of knowledge. But I'm sure there are lots of challenges when you try and do that. And particularly if those joint evaluations also include multiple UN agencies. So what's the nitty-gritty? What are the challenges around trying to make this real? And how have you tried to deal with some of those challenges?
Thank you. I think the first challenge is the UN as a system to want to agree to work together. So I think, as you mentioned, there's a lot of fragmentation in many countries, but also to understand in depth a country's ecosystem. Because then if we understand that, when we say there is no capacity or we need to build capacity, we can pinpoint what that means, because capacity can be people. So there are countries where we found that they are very smart people, there are units that are charged, but they don't have the time because they're understaffed. So capacity in that case means something very different. There are other cases where we found there aren't people actually. So you go to a ministry and there aren't any M&D staff or anyone whose job is to do evaluation work in a particular ministry. In that case, capacity means something completely different. The third point is the linkage between the line ministries and the central institution, whether it's the Prime Minister's office, the presidency, the planning commissions. So whichever central entity in a country that is charged to make sure that the evaluation agenda is implemented, and the linkage with the ministries that we work with, understanding a little more how that works or how that should work. So in some countries, we progress down the road with the line ministry only for the central entity to say, actually that evaluation was registered in our system. And to our understanding, that national program shouldn't be being evaluated. So our own knowledge of the ecosystem in a country, our knowledge of what capacity presence or absence means, and then the UN agencies agreeing to work together, especially in some ministry like education, where there's so many actors within the system, but we do evaluation separately. So being able to work together, understand the ecosystem, and define what absence of capacity means, and then acting based on that.
Okay, so let's go to the audience. I think there was a question from Rhoda. Renata, do you want to just say what that question was?
Yes, there's a question by Rauda from Tunisia. So she asks about the challenges related to the localization of the SDGs in the framework of the territorial approach. And then, if I may, there's another question, I think, yes, further down, by Miriam to Olivier. How did the FAO involve national governments? Was it mostly FAO-led or was it a joint evaluation? So I'll leave it to
Olivia, over to you.
Okay, I can take that one, that last one. It's a FAO evaluation. It was an FAO evaluation. However, FAO is a member state organization of the UN, so we respond to the membership, and the membership are states, nations. So they were very, very much interested in learning about how this agenda, global as it is, where FAO is playing its cards and all that at the global level, how it trickled down and changed anything at the country level. That was the main question asked by the countries to us. And we tried to respond to that through country case studies. I think the question on, so it was not led by governments, it was led by us, but we respond to government, we are a governmental organization. The question on the localization of the SDGs, I think is very complicated perhaps, but a quick answer to that from our evaluation was the finding in the end that the SDGs are so rich that one of the ways to simplify that message is to see in a particular place or in a particular country or district, etc., or region, what resonates with local stakeholders and decision makers, what interests them in that agenda. So the good question for me is not how to implement SDG 2 in Chile or in Zimbabwe. The good question would be, what in SDG 2 resonates with people in Chile or in Zimbabwe? And what has energy from that position, from that point of view? What do they want to invest in this very broad agenda, right? This is how I would again, in a perspective of trying to simplify things, because it's a very complicated agenda.
Thanks for that. Rauda, have you been involved with UN evaluations in Tunisia?
Hi everyone, you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank you for this initiative because it's very, very interesting. Always when we talk about SDGs and evaluation of SDGs, I think it's a very, very important question and issues because SDGs are very exhaustive goals. So even in this changement in the world with COVID-19 and the girl and the war in Ukraine. So I think we in Tunisia, we have done two reports of the monitoring of the implementation of SDGs. One report was in 2019 and the second one was in 2021. And this report, we have to try to evaluate when we are about the process of the implementation of SDGs. So I think we are together with in the framework of partnership approach. We are trying to evaluate with different stakeholders, even civil society, of course, to measure. Just like said what said the expert now, the impact of SDGs in people, and this is, I think, the very interesting thing: the impact of the implementation of SDGs in the localities, and of course in the perception of the people, because SDGs are, we want an ownership from SDGs from any people, you know, and this is, I think, it's a very, very important thing. So that's why I have the question related to the localization of SDGs, because I think SDGs can't be solved or can't be implemented in the level of the goals. It can be implemented in the level of targets of civil, the 169 civil, you know.
Rod, I'm going to have to stop you there because we've only got 5 minutes left. Thank you for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I see there's a hand up from Jauhelo. Jauhelo, do you want to just voice your question?
Yes, thank you so much, Ian, and thank you to all the presenters. Grace really was quite keen in terms of how you outlined the good approach that we can take to do joint evaluations. I just wanted to find out from yourself in terms of the progress reporting on the jointly developed action plan or improvement plan. How did you find that process? Because we are starting to learn that when there are multiple departments involved in terms of the actions that are supposed to be implemented or the recommendations, we start to see some departments or organizations pulling off and not being keen on reporting progress. So what are the effective ways that maybe you could share in terms of how we can improve on that? Thank you, Grace.
Grace, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the first thing is the entity has to have some level of convening power. So the level of engagement, let's say in the ministry, has to be at a level where the person can convene and the person can hold the counterparts accountable. So that if there are cabinet meetings, for example, then you know that the person is speaking to the peers in terms of what needs to be done to take action. But in practice, what I've seen in the countries that we've done these joint evaluations, the ministry, because the education sector is quite linked with other departments, other ministries, and they have linkages in certain programs, then they have a processes of follow-up. But what the UN does is, in some cases, we have convening power as well in countries, depending on the partnerships. So we try to use that. So I would say pitching the actions at the level where you feel that that entity has convening power, that they can put on the table the actions that need to be taken, and most importantly, having a tracking mechanism, that those recommendations go to some system, some place, and then there is a rhythm that you use to follow through and to follow up and see whether that has been implemented. So that's our experience, but it's one of the challenging elements that we're still trying to learn how that works on the government side.
Great. Well, we're coming to the end of our session, and I'd like to just ask Renata to come up with what her main takeaways are from the session.
Thanks, Ian. Just very briefly, I think we spanned through the UNEG, from the UNEG report, and then went to the country perspective. And from Uganda, this is a very good case, but I retain that there is still fragmentation in the way that UN support this country. So Mr. Lubanga mentioned many initiatives from different agencies, but still that the agencies are not always using the systems, the national systems, which is one of the recommendations of the UNEG report, to really use the national systems and have government on the driving seat. And then from Grace's, I liked very much the quote, really engaging for learning. This, I think it's fundamental. And there were also a couple of comments in the chat that reinforce this, really, because evaluation is also practice, very much practice, and not only learning in theory. So practically advancing capacities by doing joint evaluations. And then by Olivier, how we can unpack the complexity of the SDGs with which all countries are confronted with. So that was a lesson, I think, which is useful to see how we can, how countries can also unpack the complexity of evaluating SDGs. Towards country-led evaluations of the SDGs. So just really, really in a nutshell, because I see time is flying.
So thanks for that, Renata. So I think what I'm just putting the report link in the chat again, because I think we would really encourage participants to look at the report. And then from the country side, it's important for people like Tim to say, how can we now go and lobby UN agencies to say, you need to work in this way? And instead of doing your stuff in a fragmented way, you need to support us. So that's the one thing. And then from the UN agency perspective, how you lobby internally in the UN system to try and make sure that people are working in a way which is not fragmented. One point I'd just like to make, fragmentation weakens capacity. It's not neutral, it weakens capacity. So if you're working in a fragmented way, actually it's worse for countries than nothing. So thanks everybody. Thanks for your active participation. This is a topic which we're going to have to spend many years, I think, trying to make real. So let's look forward to hearing from all of you in the future how you manage to make this real and take these ideas in this more partnership way of working forward. So thanks very much. Enjoy your other local sessions, and see you all sometime in the future.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Jan.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.